project about the debate on China and Europe and the United States. Today, the topic is Chinese sharp power. As I said, this is the 5th seminar, and I hope that this series of seminars really introduce the debate of China in Spain. I will give the micro to Nicolás de Pedro, who will be the moderator of today's seminars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mira, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar that, as Mira has said, we will be today we'll be discussing about China's sharp power, which can be barely translated into Spanish as el poder afilado de China somehow. And we will do our best to shed light on this concept and what China is doing and why the West should care about it. And to do so, we have 3 outstanding speakers. So I will briefly introduce them for those of you who don't know them. First, we have Jakub Janda, who is the Director of European Values think tank in Prague. Jakub specializes in responses of democratic states to hostile disinformation and influence operations. He's Associate Fellow at the Slovak Security Policy Institute and a regular contributor for the Atlantic Council. Well, he has a long CV. Just let me say that in 2016-17, he was tasked by the Czech security and intelligence institutions to consult on influence of foreign powers chapter within audit of national security conducted by the Czech government. Secondly, we have Monika Richter, who works at the intersection of disinformation, digital threats, and tech policy. She has recently joined Semantic Visions, an analytics firms operating a military-grade OSINT, open sources intelligence system, that aggregates and analyzes 90% of the world's news content, and which has offices in Prague, London, and Washington, where Monika is based, although she's now connecting from the Washington state, so on the other side of the US. Prior to that, Monika served as the Czech Republic's seconded national expert on disinformation at the EU's East Stratcom Task Force. And last but not least, we have Xiani Perez-Cheng, who has been a lecturer on Taiwan studies from 2008 till 2017 at the University of Salamanca. And later on, she has been researching China's disinformation and influence operations in Spain. And she's currently a research fellow associate with Resilient Futures think tank in London. So, as it's obvious that you have a strong expertise and you are all very familiar with today's topic, China's sharp power, but most likely not everyone is. So let us start from the basic. I think that would be useful and interesting to everyone. So let me start with you, Jakub. How would you define or characterize sharp power? What makes it specific or different from hard power, soft power? And what should we look at or pay attention to when it comes to China? Floor is yours, Jakub. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico, and thank you to FAES and the Institute for Statecraft for having me. So I think in the long run, if you look into how powers are used by governments, I mean, usually friendly countries use soft power. So cultural diplomacy, we actually try to explain what our countries stand for, even when we have disagreements, even allies have disagreements between each other, and that's regular and that's normal. To some extent, you could say Europeans had a lot of disagreements with President Trump, for example, but those were, but still we are allies, and still those were tough disagreements, but they were between allies. What is sharp power? In various ways, how you could call it. Basically, it's about interfering or pushing the other actor, the other country, to do something what you want. And pushing them in a negative or in hostile fashion. That's something what is different. We have seen countries doing this across recent centuries, or in our history, that's normal. But what is new now is that we have seen mainly Russia doing or using sharp power, which includes disinformation, so intentional lies which are spread as military or intelligence operations. That's how Russia has been organizing it. Approximately, I mean, we could say since 2008, since Russia invaded Georgia. or it intensified since 2014, since Russia invaded Ukraine. But we could see China doing using very similar tactics. I would argue since 2018. There were several, against European countries. China has been doing this in Southeast Asia for many years or many decades. But what we have seen here in Europe is that China has been organizing, for example, hostile disinformation, and it started on human rights abuses, because we know that China organizes slave labor programs in China, and now we have several parliaments, Dutch, Canadian, or the US Parliament, saying that China actually organizes genocide of one of its ethnic groups. And why I'm speaking about disinformation is that when such a government like the Chinese government does this, they try to lie about it, and lie about it in a way that trying to persuade other governments in the world and other populations that China is not doing it. So that's generally how China uses this information. But what is relatively unique on this scale for China is that China actually can use and does use economic leverage, which is even worse. Because China actually uses economic leverage against European countries, and we could actually see a tool which we could call strategic blackmail, which practically means that China would send its ambassador, for example, the Chinese ambassador to Berlin, which will actually say to the local population or to the local government, well, if you will be criticizing us on COVID or on human rights issues, we will actually punish you economically. We will crush your car industry in China, for example. And that's what we have seen from Chinese ambassador to Germany. We have seen a very similar behavior by Chinese ambassadors in Stockholm, in Prague, in Paris as well. So this hostile behavior is something what is relatively new. We haven't seen this being done by China, until now, until 1 or 2 years ago. Just to finish up the long expose, let's say, is that there are several things China really cares about in Europe. One, lying about the human rights, meaning genocide of Uyghurs, for example, and the forced labor program or slave program. Second, COVID. So China tries to lie about the origins of COVID, and because it is a proven fact that China actually lied at the beginning of the pandemic and manipulated the medical data and tried to silence medical professionals inside China at the beginning of the pandemic last year. And China tries to portray itself as a savior, which is now coming to save Europe, which is completely absurd. But this is what China does. And then we see a very same objectives of China in Europe, which are same with Russia, and that is trying to push out alliances with the United States. I mean, European alliances with the United States. That's something what China hasn't been doing until recently, because China tried to persuade Europeans that China is only friendly. But now we see hostile disinformation spread by Chinese actors, even the governmental figures like Chinese diplomats. So that's relatively new. There are many aspects of what China is doing in its sharp power, so what is hostile to us as Europeans. But this is what I think are the new kids on the table, new plays on the table, let's say.
Thank you very much, Jakub, for such a comprehensive and wide description of the issue. So let me turn now to you, Monica. How do you see this issue, this question of sharp power, Chinese sharp power? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico, and likewise, thank you for the invitation today. So sharp power is a fairly new term. I believe it was coined in 2017 by the National Endowment for Democracy in the US. Basically to describe novel international projections of authoritarian influence, specifically by Russia and China, but increasingly other autocracies as well, really to undermine the primacy of democratic norms and institutions, and generally the principles of open societies like free speech and human rights. Fundamentally, authoritarian sharp power is about creating perceptions of legitimacy for these regimes in subversive, manipulative, and coercive ways, and preventing democratic states from acting cogently in their own self-interest. So on the spectrum from hard power, right, meaning traditional military or economic clout, to soft power, meaning public diplomacy, or the idea of winning hearts and minds. Sharp power falls somewhere in between. It's about manipulating target audiences in other countries through the distortion of the information environment and political incentives, ultimately with the goal of revising the international order to be more accommodating and welcoming to the interests of anti-democratic regimes. So in this sense, I would say that it also represents the assertive hardening of authoritarianism around the world, and as well the consolidation of these regimes in places like Russia and China, of course, despite decades of efforts by the West to integrate them into the rules-based international order, in hopes that this would promote democratization. And in fact, the opposite has happened, and these regimes are now turning our own efforts against us in the projection of authoritarianism abroad. Specifically in the case of China, which I would argue is also most successful in deploying sharp power, this involves digital censorship, economic leverage, as Jakub mentioned, cultural and educational initiatives like the Confucius Institutes, the development of media and tech enterprises, and increasingly also disinformation, as Jakub said, where there is now increasing convergence in terms of tactics with Russian disinformation efforts. And many of the Chinese political and cultural influence efforts are designed to imitate the activities of democratic civil societies in Western countries, or democratic countries in general, not just the West. And that imitation is to bypass detection for what these efforts really are, which are tools of political warfare. And you know, unfortunately, it's the very features of open societies that make us particularly vulnerable to this kind of exploitation and subversion. Our democratic strengths are being weaponized against us. And you know, again, as I said, this term was founded in 2017, so this is still a relatively new challenge and geopolitical shift, and it really requires us to fundamentally rethink our conception of security. In my view, what that would mean is a reinvigoration of the idea of democratic security for the 21st century in a broader sense, in which we prioritize the impenetrability and resilience of our societies to these malign forms of foreign influence. And right now, you know, I'm afraid that Europe is falling very far behind in this effort, and that too many leaders and policymakers fail to understand the stakes that we're facing. You know, and perhaps we can come back to this later, but it was something that, you know, I certainly experienced firsthand while I was working for the European Union. Perhaps some of you registered the incident about the EU's censorship of a report on Chinese COVID disinformation as a result of Chinese pressure. You know, that is just one example of how you know, this sharp power works in practice, and how, you know, political incentives combined, unfortunately, with, you know, economic interdependence or European dependence on China, you know, can really lead to unfortunate outcomes and a abdication of responsibility to uphold the democratic values and principles that the EU claims it represents on the world stage. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica. Excellent as well, excellent introduction to the topic, and also you have also opened many different avenues for the discussion later on. So now it's your turn, Xiani. How do you see this issue of Chinese sharp power as your view?
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And I subscribe everything so far that Jakub and Monica have stated. And I will add, as Monica has stated, that sharp power relies on, and specifically China's sharp power relies on weaponizing our values, our democratic values as a democratic society. And the way China use this sharp power to their advantage is even our democratic societies. They try to turn our democratic societies into their image. They try to corrupt our democratic societies, our democratic values. And we can, for example, we can use the example of, as Monica has mentioned, the Confucius Institutes, and every single university in our Western countries and Western democracies that have Confucius Institute, they pose a risk. And even those universities who don't have Confucius Institute, but they have agreements with China, those agreement pose a risk in the sense of they try to censor our freedom of speech in our universities, for example. In our university, using this economic warfare or weaponizing trade, and they use their, for example, they use their students, this China's embassies and China regime states. Okay, if we have an agreement, or even we have a Confucius Institute in your university, you cannot speak or talk or research even in certain topics of Tiananmen, what is happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs minority. Of course, not talking about Taiwan or what the conflict on South China Sea. And you cannot speak on those topics, you cannot research on those topics, because we also have seen that even in conference, they try to manipulate and censor the topics on conference, as we saw in a Portuguese university in 2014. So I think the main point of sharp power is not that China is trying to subvert our democratic values on our own soil, subvert our institutions. So those our institutions, they start parroting China's propaganda. They start behaving like China's institution, with self-censorship and and adopting the China's propaganda. And I think that for us in the West, this should be our main concern. This should be our main concern on how we protect ourselves from this kind of interference, from this kind of erosion of our democratic institutions. And for example, Spain is right now. Spain is so proud that even China's investment has been reduced around the world, but in Spain has duplicated the trade and inversions, especially trades in pork exports from Spain, that has been duplicated, and trade investments in Spain has been duplicated. Okay, the Spanish government and the Spanish economic community and business people, they feel proud about this, but we should analyze the underlying cost of these investments, on these exports, on this trade agreement, because it's going to cost us. It's going to cost us in the sense of our economic issues, because China is going to weaponize the economic and trade links we have with them, and on democratic values. And the question should be: are we going to? Are we willing to expose ourselves? Are we willing to sacrifice our values for that? And I think that's the main question. What are we willing to sacrifice for China?
Thank you, Shiani. I don't think we will manage to solve that issue today, but at least we will try. So in your first intervention, Jakub, among many other interesting things, you mentioned the role of several parliaments in the West. And I know that you are very actively involved in many initiatives. I'm aiming to tackle this issue, to raise awareness and to forge political alliances across the West. So I would like to know what can you tell us about these initiatives, Jakub? Well, keeping in mind that this is an on-the-record event, and in general terms, what is your assessment of the West's response to China's challenge so far?
Yes, so I would say mainly about the European response. The American is slightly different for obvious reasons, but the European response to Chinese intimidation is actually very weak, and it's driven by fear of economic retaliation. That's what most of the actors would tell you. That's why Germany and France, which are driving the weak, soft, or appeasement policy towards China in Europe, that's what their main issues are. I think that's it is not smart. I mean, myself being a Czech citizen, in our history, we know that appeasement never works. If you appease the dictator will only get more aggressive. And that is what we already can see, not only with Russia, but also with China. So once there is more pressure which China is exerting on us, and just remember all the intimidations which China did across Europe on the 5G policy decisions. So on sovereign decisions of European countries who will build their own critical information infrastructure. Chinese government was going across Europe and pushing many people, many governments, trying to basically blackmail them into choosing a Chinese vendor. Most of the governments didn't decide for a Chinese espionage companies, which is good, but we only can see China getting more aggressive every year. So that is, I think, the big picture of the European response to China is that China is more aggressive to us, and Europeans are, I'm afraid we as Europeans are quite weak in responding because we are so afraid of the economic pushback. But we are in a powerful position towards China because China sees that, I mean, the main adversary for China are the United States, but China knows very well that Europe is the main market for China now and for the future, which means that the leverage is on the European side. Because if we as Europeans are the main market for China for the future, I mean, in various trade aspects, then we are in a powerful position to tell China, you should stop treating us like this. You should stop blackmailing us. And if you want to have a trade deal with us or investment deal, which is now being negotiated, you need to end the genocide policy, which you are now conducting on your own population. And that is what I think Europeans should do. Not only for the sake of human rights, but also for the sake of national security of European countries, because we need to stop the Chinese bullying. We cannot, let's say, make China disappear. But what we can do and what we should do is that we should stand strong and tell to the Chinese government, you want our money, you want our trade, we are happy to do trade with you, but you need to stop bullying us and you need to stop this policy of genocide, because we know what it is as Europeans, and we have all the leverages, the economic or trade leverages on our side, and China knows it is on the shorter leash, let's say, in this fight. But we as Europeans are not doing it because of our fears and quite often greed, because some of the European companies which are having good business in China are lobbying very well to European politicians. I'm speaking mainly about German car and chemical industry, but there are many others, not only them. And they are lobbying very well to European politicians, that the European politicians in the end are actually being weak and saying, look, the Chinese will promise something and we'll just believe them. but we see China lying all the time. So it's a worthless piece of paper if China just promises something and doesn't do it. So I think that's our problem. We just don't stand up for our own values as we should, and not only for principled and human rights reasons, but for national security reasons as well.
Thank you very much, Jakub. And Monica, Jakub was mentioning, was leaving aside in his intervention the US, which it's probably the answer or the response is fairly different from that of Europe. So what do you think is the perspective from Washington? As we know, the timing of the signing of the comprehensive agreement investment was not received, let's say, with a lot of enthusiasm. So what you can tell us about this perspective from Washington?
Yeah, definitely. The comprehensive agreement on investment was most definitely not received well in Washington. There was an effort, by Biden's team to reach out to Europe and to ask for cooperation on China. That was a major priority for the incoming administration. And the fact that the Europeans snubbed Washington, that really stung. And in one sense, it's understandable because we, of course, know how the Trump administration not just neglected but outright disparaged alliances. And so, again, on the one hand, it's understandable that Europe would want to show a certain independence in this regard. One rationale for approving or pushing through the investment agreement was that, of course, the United States had already negotiated its own trade deal with China. That was not done, of course, in coordination with the Europeans. But pushing it through regardless, is very naive on the European side. I completely agree with Jakub's assessment about the European naivete on this issue. From the DC perspective, the first thing that I want to emphasize is really the remarkable bipartisanship on China in the US and the apparent policy continuity from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And in the domestic context of US politics, where policy making on virtually every issue is just hamstrung by reflexive partisanship, this consensual approach to China is really nothing short of extraordinary. We don't see it really on Russia to the same degree, for example, despite the Russian interference in the 2016 election. And for Europeans, that should really underscore two related points. First, that China is the foremost foreign policy priority right now for Republicans as well as Democrats alike, representing a pretty significant reorientation from previous administrations, even a reorientation from the Obama administration that pursued a fairly close relationship with China, even though a lot of former Obama people are now joining the Biden administration. There is a clear priority reorientation in that regard. And secondly, that there is sufficient political will in Washington to get things done on China. The U.S. is also actively seeking to enlist allies, specifically in countering China's technology push. This is, going to have hopefully both offensive and defensive elements, as was recently reported. And indeed, countering China's technology push should absolutely be a priority for national security reasons, both in Washington and in Europe. And so, I very much hope that this is somewhere where the Europeans are going to be willing to cooperate. with Washington. One of the things, as we know, that China is exceptionally good at doing in Europe is pursuing bilateral relationships oftentimes, and trying to create tensions within the EU. And now we're seeing, increasing consequences of that as well, where, in context of the traditional, American security guarantee that is taken very seriously in Eastern Europe, we're seeing that many smaller states are choosing to side with the US on the China issue, more so than they're willing to side with Germany and France on some of these questions. So, I mean, NATO and, again, the American security guarantee is decisive for a lot of smaller states. We're seeing that some smaller governments, from the Baltics, from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic, that they're canceling public tenders that Chinese state-owned companies were set to win, or they're moving to limit Chinese investing and contracting. I mean, there still isn't, a decisive wave in that direction, but we're certainly seeing, movement in that regard. And all of this creates tensions between those smaller Eastern states and the larger EU states, namely Germany and France, of course, that are pursuing closer ties with China. And that fragmentation is really only a gift to the CCP. And I really hope that, at least on the technology front, which is, perhaps the, most important front in countering Chinese ascendance, that is something where the Europeans will be receptive to Washington's overtures.
Thank you very much, Monica. And Shiani, beyond the transatlantic link, perhaps we can also include the role of other Asian democratic powers that has been mentioned on this series of webinars, actually, including, of course, Australia, South Korea, Japan, India, but very rarely Taiwan. So what's your take on that? How should the West approach the Indo-Pacific in general, maybe, and the question of Taiwan in particular?
Well, I think that this question has been, the West is trying to engage with Asian countries, Asian democratic countries. We have seen in this 5 Eyes Plus that they're including in Japan, for example, and we are also seeing in the Quad Plus dialogue that they are also incorporating, apart from the main countries, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. They are trying to incorporate another countries that I think that in the very near future, this is going to be the new normal, for coining an expression. For the 5 Eyes Plus and for the Quad Plus and this kind of alliance, I think that and especially right now with the new Biden-Harris administration, that they are they're not seeking this this propaganda about the American first. They are going to try to reach another countries in Europe, for example, France and Germany, and also the European Union, the alliance with the United Kingdom, of course, but also in the Far East with Japan, South Korea, and further south with Australia and New Zealand. And the thing is, as you pointed out, Taiwan, the question of Taiwan, I think is, I believe and I hope that the new Biden-Harris administrations, they are going to keep supporting Taiwan as the former administration with there are some weapons trade or weapons sellings from the United States, weapons platforms that they are already agreed, and I hope these platforms will be sold to effectively will be sold to Taiwan for their defense. And I think right now the main focus is on microchips and semiconductors. That there is a so-called technological war right now, international war, for the supplies of microchips and semiconductors. Because, for example, German car industry need this semiconductors and microchip supply, and Taiwan is one of the Taiwan's semiconductor company is one of the forefront and most important semiconductors companies right now. So it's going to be interesting how these tensions are going to play between, for example, Taiwan, this Taiwan and United States alliance right now in the terms of semiconductors, because Taiwan Semiconductors company has agreed to open a manufacturing plant in Arizona, in the United States, in Arizona. So the United States is trying to make themselves less dependent on outside imports. And right now also the EU or European countries, they are also looking for this, trying to be more independent, and they are looking, okay, let's try to get some semiconductors plants here in Europe. But for example, Germany has snapped Taiwan, because Taiwan has been asking Germany for vaccines in exchange for microchips. And because of China's pressure, they have rejected this deal. So it's going to be interesting from the Europeans' point of view how European country can be self-reliant regarding this microchips and semiconductors industry, and having this pressure from China not to deal, for example, with Taiwan, because Taiwan is willing. Taiwan is willing, of course, is willing to reach out to the international community. But I think that nowadays Taiwan administration is not willing to reach to the international community for nothing. They have their own priorities, they have their own interests, and they are willing to bargain or to trade on that, but not reaching to the outside for nothing.
Thank you very much, Yanni. A very interesting point. I didn't know that there was this offer of getting vaccines in exchange of microchips. And it was blocked by China. That's very interesting. And I guess we should inform our conspiracy theorist, because I think it has a lot of, can be related to it. And Jakub, let me ask you about Taiwan as well, because there seems to be a lot going on between, or it seems at least from an outsider as me, from Czech Republic, between the Czech Republic and Taiwan. There was this, how to say, highly discussed visit of a Czech delegation to Taiwan. What can you tell us about this visit? Is there something else going on, something to look at? There's something more substantial going on, and what was this visit about? Thank you, Jakub.
Czech Republic is one of the few countries in Europe which actually has more Taiwanese investment than the Chinese one, which is quite unique economically speaking. There is much more of Taiwanese money flowing into the Czech Republic than the Chinese one. Taiwan is seen very, very positively among Czech population. We are experiencing elite capture, so the Czech president and part of the government are actually working with China or for China, for the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, we actually have a strong parliamentary opposition, which is actually very much pro-Taiwan. So we have had quite a strong support for Taiwan. That's what you are referring to. We actually had a trip of the Czech Senate Speaker, who is the second highest constitutional figure in the Czech system, to Taiwan, and there was a business delegation as well. So it was the first Senate Speaker from Europe in many years to travel to Taiwan and to the first one after the second election of President Tsai in Taiwan. So that's why I think it was positive and important. So there is quite a lot of substantial ties between Czech Republic and Taiwan. There are the economic ones. There are political ties between parliamentary opposition and Taiwanese institutions. We have had we have a strong mayor of Prague from the Pirate Party, which actually has strong connections to Taiwan as well. This mayor of Prague, or a city of Prague, actually cancelled a sister city agreement with city of Beijing and launched a new one with city of Taipei, which meant there was a massive harassment campaign from China against city of Prague. There was a boycott of Prague from China as well. So quite many activities, which I would say have been seen very negatively among the Czech population, in a way that when you see a Chinese government, Chinese communists actually blackmailing mayor of Prague just because he changed one agreement and he invited a mayor of Taipei to Prague, for example, people in Prague or people in the Czech Republic start thinking like, what the hell are the Chinese thinking really? So that's what has been happening here in the Czech Republic over the last 2 or 3 years on Taiwan, and there are more cultural ties. Because of COVID, there is no traveling. But for example, we as European Value Center, we are going to open our own office in Taipei this year. And there will be more of cooperation, because from what we know, Taiwan is actually very good in learning or responding to Chinese influence operations. I would actually say that we as EVC, as European Value Center, we are trying to learn from the best. And by that, I mean mainly from Ukrainians, Georgians, and the Baltic friends on how to respond to Russian malign influence activities, and trying to learn from the Taiwanese how to respond to Chinese malign influence activities, because they know it. Taiwan has been a forefront of Chinese aggression in influence operations for many years or many decades actually. So they are in a tough position. They are in a similar position like where, for example, State of Israel is against its enemies, or let's say the Baltic countries are against a big Russian neighbor. The good news for the Baltic countries is that they are in NATO, while Taiwan is actually alone with some US military guarantee, which is good, but Europeans don't really care about Taiwan, unfortunately. There are some who do, like the Czechs or some of the Czechs, but not everybody. So I think that's what Taiwan is, and it's a democratic, friendly country, unlike China. So for that reason, I think there are many also pragmatic reasons why to engage with Taiwan. The sharing lessons learned from responding to China, that's the main one for us.
Thank you very much, Jakub. And it's very interesting. I already heard that European Values was planning to open an office in Taipei, and I think it's very interesting. And I congratulate you. It's a very interesting step. So, Monica, Jakub was referring about learning from others' experience, from those who have suffered this kind of threats and harassment in the past years. So that means Georgia, Ukraine, Taiwan, etc. And you are very familiar and have a lot of experience when it comes to disinformation. And I think this year of pandemic, it's clear that it has been a wake-up call for Europeans and many in the West, also regarding Russian disinformation, but as well about Chinese disinformation. So what can you tell us in terms of how to better deal or face or tackle the question of disinformation? What would be your 2 or 3 tips for those who have to deal with it?
Thank you. Yes, the disinformation question has certainly gained quite a bit of prominence this past year. You know, the really interesting thing that I observed, and you know, throughout the first half of 2020, I was working still for the Stratcom task force in Brussels, where we were dealing with an ascendance also of Chinese disinformation around COVID, expanding our focus from you know, a primarily Russian-oriented agenda in this regard to the Chinese as well. And the really interesting thing that we observed was a remarkable convergence in tactics. And I say convergence and not coordination. That's important. There was no evidence that the Russians and Chinese were actively cooperating in the spread of disinformation narratives and conspiracy theories around the virus. But the, for example, the use of conspiracy theories, which is something that the Russians have been doing for many years to muddy the informational landscape, that was something that we saw very quickly, you know, adopted and adapted by the Chinese, namely, for example, the idea that the coronavirus is a biological weapon produced by the United States or by NATO and brought to China from abroad, from the US especially. You know, this was something that was even floated, you know, by Chinese diplomats on social media. It was pushed on social media as well, you know, by SOC accounts. And it was something that, you know, also became prominent in Chinese state media. And this was, I mean, quite a remarkable shift, and it revealed the degree to which the Chinese were very desperate to control the international narrative around COVID, to deflect responsibility, and instead to, you know, point to the weaknesses of Western countries in responding effectively, contrasting that with the apparently much more successful approach of a closed system, you know, to secure public health. And, you know, I'll just mention in brief the example, you know, that, you know, actually ultimately led me to resign for reasons of conscience. Because indeed, you know, when we wrote a report, you know, looking at Russian and Chinese narratives around the coronavirus, you know, this reached the attention of Chinese diplomats in Beijing, and they approached the EU delegation in Beijing, and you know, basically made not even concrete threats, but vague threats about how the you know, publication of such a report, claiming that there was a global disinformation campaign, a global Chinese disinformation campaign around COVID, that would be very negative, you know, for relations. Now, you know, nothing was made explicit, but this is exactly how the Chinese operate. And of course, what was, you know, the big thing that was on the table for 2020, right? It was the investment agreement. You know, we knew that the Germans were, you know, very anxious to push this through. You know, and so even though it wasn't ever explicitly said, you know, that the agreement was on the table, that was certainly how it was interpreted, you know, by many in Brussels. And, you know, yes, that the reality is, despite the EU's consistent denials that there was any censorship or editing, you know, I can state on the record that that is a lie. There was editing that took place, political editing, you know, motivated by the desire to not single out, you know, two actors for spreading disinformation around the pandemic. And, you know, the in the public report, the headlining, you know, of a section on China, that was removed, and several references to China were omitted, including the reference to a global disinformation campaign. And then a few other examples were just placed under, you know, another more generic section. And so, you know, that this is a case study of exactly how we don't respond. You know, there was another example that followed shortly after this, when, you know, there was a letter published by the EU, well, the European External Action Service, with all of the EU member state ambassadors to China to celebrate the anniversary of relations between the EU and China. I believe it was the 45th anniversary. You know, it was an op-ed that was meant to be published in, was it the Global Times or China Daily? Now I can't remember. I apologize. But in any case, you know, there was a decision, you know, taken unilaterally by the EEAS at, you know, the request of the Chinese to omit references to COVID's origins in China. That led to a lot of outrage subsequently. And during the pandemic, and I'll wrap this up, I know my answer is getting long, but, you know, during the pandemic in 2020, there seemed to be a recognition that China was playing dirty, and that, you know, we really have to reevaluate our stance. In the EU-China summit, there was a fairly remarkable moment when von der Leyen called out the Chinese, you know, to their faces about their spreading of COVID disinformation, about malicious mask diplomacy. That was fairly remarkable. You know, such a forceful statement hadn't, you know, been done before. And so, you know, but we have one step forward and then two steps back, because, you know, after this signaling and recognition that, you know, there are clearly problems in the relationship, that the Chinese, you know, are you know, not acting in democratically compatible ways. You know, we go ahead and we sign the investment agreement, right, driven by, you know, German mercantilist foreign policy and Macron's, you know, fuzzy and utterly naive notion of strategic autonomy, right? I mean, strategic autonomy to what end, right? That remains undefined. It seems to be defined only as, you know, a desire, you know, of a, and I'm sorry to put this a little bit crudely, right, of a child to show that it doesn't have to listen to its parents in a way, right? For Europe to show that it doesn't have to follow the American lead. You know, it's a certain, you know, obstinacy that damages our national interest and democratic security. I'll leave it there. I'm sorry for going on for too long.
No, thank you very much, Monica. Very interesting. And that's clearly sharp power in action. So I think it's very enlightening. And as we're approaching our time limit, I would like to get one question from the chat to rephrase it a bit, but it's basically the same question, because we have been talking about well, investments, how they weaponize our vulnerabilities as open and democratic societies, political infiltration, how the European companies are lobbying for the interests, and this is maybe a strategic setback for the EU. And the question is from our chat is what needs to happen in order to have the European leaders change their approach to China. So the question could be as well, what can be done? And how should we raise awareness regarding Chinese sharp power, having in mind that all these economic interests are there and will not go or will not disappear anytime soon. So this is going to play a significant role. And I think we can start in the reverse order this time. So I will start with you, Shiani. What needs to be done at least in Europe? So how should we approach this Chinese sharp power?
Oh, this is the million-dollar question.
A million-dollar question. Sorry that I need everyone to answer in approximately 90 seconds or 2 minutes maximum. Thank you.
I'm going to start from what Monica, I think what Monica said is about this strategic autonomy and how we are here in Europe. We are behaving in a childish or teenagers behavior. regarding how we treat China. So I think that here in Europe we must do a soul searching dialogue with ourselves, within ourselves as member states, and within the EU of what do we really want to be our relation with China be like. That we should if we want to open ourselves to China's market, should we put any screening mechanism to our investments, or preconditions about labor rights or human rights? We have to engage here in the EU. Have to engage in a meaningful dialogue, and even in spite our member states' inner interests, because this is what is getting most in the way. So, what is the relations we want to have with China? Meaningful, sustainable relations within keeping our values, our democratic values, our democratic values that is not, they're not only for our own interests, because this is also Europe's, we're talking about soft power, this is Europe's soft powers at human rights and democratic values projections to the outside. And maybe this is, some people will argue that, well, this is considering the current pandemic and the current situation, values gets tossed outside the window. This because they are not effective, they are not practical, they are not. We can live without them, considering what's going on with the pandemic and the vaccinations and all this narrative. But okay, call me an idealist, but I stand with those values, with those democratic values, because well, from a personal point of view, you know, I'm half Spanish, half Taiwanese. In both countries, we all have experienced dictatorships. We all have experienced this memoria histórica, as they say in Spanish. We say in Taiwan is they are also still working towards that issue. And for example, yesterday in Taiwan, they celebrated, not celebrated, but commemorated the 74th anniversary of a huge massacre that cost the lives of almost 30,000 Taiwanese people at the hands of China's nationalist dictatorships. And I think we have to, we also have this in Germany with the Nazis, in Italy, in Spain. We all have this experience here in Europe. And we should not forget about this experience when dealing with China.
Thank you very much, Yani. Monica, what needs to be done and how? The $1 million question in 90 seconds. What's your take?
Thank you. So I'll answer this a little bit more philosophically, if I may. I think with some very concrete ideas as well. You know, for me, it's a real mindset issue. You know, I'm profoundly concerned about Europe's ability to adapt to the shifting geopolitical landscape of the 21st century. And what I mean by that is facing up to the defining, and I would say indeed existential conflict of our time between democracy and authoritarianism. this is something that Biden has been talking about recently, talking a lot about. And I want to be clear that this isn't fear-mongering or simply, binary simplistic thinking about good and bad. It's really a deliberate and considered reading of the unprecedented security challenges that face the global community of liberal democratic states, and the very high stakes at play. As we've discussed here today, China is perhaps the most unprecedented of these challenges. It's a highly ambitious, shrewd, economically powerful adversary whose political and economic system is fundamentally hostile to democratic values and interests. And it's utterly naive to continue thinking, as we do too often in Europe, that we can compartmentalize our engagement with the CCP to economic integration and cooperation on climate change, for example, without simultaneously exposing ourselves to corrupting and insidious anti-democratic influences. And that's, of course, nothing, to say nothing about, the matter of compromising our values and selling out on democracy abroad, elsewhere in the world. The bottom line is that there is no middle way between democracy and authoritarianism. To think otherwise is to sign a Faustian deal, but I'm afraid that that's precisely the trajectory of Europe's China policy. As I said, spearheaded for the most part by Germany's mercantilist and values agnostic foreign policy, and especially Macron's ideas of strategic autonomy. If we could have anything in terms of response, right? It would be a combination of, as I mentioned, an alliance between, the global community of liberal democratic states on containing China's technological ascendance, ensuring that we remain leaders in technological innovation, so that we can shape digital norms going forward through the 21st century. This should be a practical priority beginning now, immediately. Also insulating ourselves from malign forms of influence that exploit, as mentioned earlier, the democratic vulnerabilities that these regimes are exploiting and turning against us. And then finally, a very effective mechanism is Magnitsky sanctions. Unfortunately, the political will right now in Europe does not exist to make significant progress in many of these areas. At least, I'm sorry for being so pessimistic, but that's certainly my interpretation. But that political will, and also if I may, moral courage to stand up for what is right, to invoke genocide, to acknowledge that is what the Chinese are doing, and that requires significant action, in defense of human rights. This is something that really shouldn't even need to be talked about in the way that we are talking about it here today. It actually makes me very sad. So really, without political will and without a recognition, as I said, that there is no middle way between democracy and authoritarianism, I think it's very difficult to make progress on some of these, more practical policy matters. Hopefully, Jakub will end on a more optimistic note than me.
Thank you very much, Monica. Jakub, over to you.
I want. Just in practical terms, I think we should start behaving to China as we do to any other rogue or hostile country. So, for example, when we have Chinese ambassadors blackmailing us, we should send them home. Or when we have Chinese intelligence officers posing as diplomats or organizing espionage in Europe, we should actually expel them. This the same way how we do it to Russians, Iranians, Cubans, anybody like that. That's exactly what we should do, and we are not doing it. Because if you look across Europe and the way how European countries, European governments actually expel Chinese intelligence officers, it's very, very limited. It was actually Lithuania as one of the first ones to do it publicly and declare that they are sending home a Chinese diplomat posing as intelligence officer, for example. That's something what we should start doing on China, and we should actually start responding to their blackmail campaign. So, for example, when they say, look, we are going to crush you economically if you don't allow Huawei into your 5G networks, we should say, okay, so we are stopping our trade negotiations with you until you start acting in a civilized way. That's how we should behave, because we are sovereign nations and we do not act like ones when we are dealing with China. So, bottom line is this, and there are so many aspects of where we are taking China as if they were gods, but they are not. They are just another country which is strong, but Europe or the European Union together is actually very strong in economic terms. But we should actually stand up for our own values. And again, it's not only about human rights, it's about national security, because China keeps pressuring us. They keep stealing our secrets, stealing our technological secrets, for example, across Europe on a massive scale. And we are not defending ourselves. So we should actually start. And I will stop here because otherwise that will be too long. So.
Thank you very much, Jakub. Thank you very much, Monica, Jakub, Shiani. It was an excellent discussion, and I think it brings many different ideas and perspectives to our series of webinars. So it's very much appreciated. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you all soon and next time in person, and not via Zoom or any other platform. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.